Most people think financial crises are moments of failure, when systems break and leaders lose control. History shows something far less obvious. Crises are moments of decision compression. Time collapses, options narrow, and authority quietly expands. When markets fall rapidly, societies stop asking what is fair and start asking what is fast. That shift matters more than most people realize, because speed does not come from consensus, it comes from centralization. In moments of panic, decision-making migrates upward, away from public debate, and toward institutions designed to act without permission. This isn't a conspiracy, it's a response to fear. Crises create an environment where delay feels dangerous and questioning feels irresponsible. That psychological shift is the real opening, not for recovery, but for power. If you value calm, historically grounded explanations of how systems really work, consider subscribing to History of Finance Decoded. This channel exists to understand structures, not dramatize them. And this pattern, crisis followed by control, has repeated often enough that it deserves closer attention. In normal times, authority is constrained by process. Laws move slowly, institutions compete, power is distributed because society can afford debate. Financial crises reverse that logic. Panic reframes speed as virtue. Whoever can act fastest gains legitimacy, not because they are right, but because hesitation now carries visible cost. Markets punish delay, jobs disappear, savings evaporate. Under these conditions, centralized action feels comforting. It creates the impression of order in chaos. But comfort has consequences. When speed becomes legitimacy, authority no longer needs agreement, only urgency. Decisions that would face resistance in calm conditions are accepted without question during panic. This is how temporary powers enter systems quietly, not announced as expansions, but justified as necessities. Few people object because fear narrows attention. The goal becomes survival, not structure. And once authority learns that speed silences opposition, the incentive to preserve that speed doesn't disappear when markets stabilize. Crises do not abolish rules, they suspend them. This distinction matters. Suspension feels temporary, it sounds reversible, and psychologically it lowers resistance. People tolerate pauses more easily than permanent change. During financial collapses, safeguards are described as obstacles, procedures become luxuries, oversight becomes delay, and limits, once framed as protections, are reframed as risks. This is where power expands without announcing itself. Authority steps in just for now. Measures are introduced until stability returns, yet systems remember what people forget. Once limits are lifted successfully, once intervention works, restoring those limits feels unnecessary, even dangerous. The justification changes from emergency to efficiency. What began as a pause quietly becomes precedent, and precedent, repeated often enough, becomes structure. This is how crises train systems to operate with fewer constraints than before, while maintaining the language of temporariness. Centralization during crises does not feel imposed, it feels logical. Fear simplifies thinking, complexity feels unsafe, distributed decision-making looks chaotic when outcomes deteriorate quickly. In these moments, concentration of authority feels like clarity, one plan, one direction, one voice. That psychological relief is powerful, but clarity comes at a cost. Centralized systems reduce choice by design. They streamline action by narrowing participation. And once people experience the stability that comes from concentrated control, even briefly, decentralization starts to feel inefficient, risky, optional. This is how crises recalibrate expectations. People stop asking who decides and focus only on whether decisions produce relief. Power expands not because it is demanded, but because it is tolerated.
and tolerance repeated across crises becomes normalization. Here is the critical point most histories overlook. Systems learn from crises even when people do not. Institutions adapt, frameworks evolve, authority remembers what worked. When centralized control stabilizes a collapse, the lesson is internalized. The next crisis arrives and the response is faster, broader, and less debated. Not because leaders are more confident, but because the system already knows the path. This is how power accumulation becomes quiet. Each crisis builds on the last. Each emergency expands the baseline. And because these expansions occur under stress, they are rarely reversed. People remember the shock, systems remember the opportunity, and over time, financial crises stop being disruptions. They become rehearsals. The financial panic of the late 19th century marked a turning point, not because it was the first crisis, but because it was the first truly modern one. Capital moved faster than governments were prepared for. Railways, industrial credit, and cross-border finance had quietly interconnected economies long before regulators understood the consequences. When confidence collapsed, the shock traveled instantly. What failed was not just speculation, but decentralization itself. Local responses proved too slow. Independent banks acted in self-interest. Fragmented authorities produced confusion instead of stability. The lesson absorbed by institutions was subtle but decisive. Dispersed control could not manage systemic panic. Coordination became necessity. Not ideological coordination, operational coordination. Crises began to justify the idea that someone somewhere needed a broader view than markets alone could provide. And once that logic entered governance, it never fully left.
Out of this crisis emerged a quiet belief that standardization was safety. Common rules reduced uncertainty. Shared practices reduced panic. Uniform responses reassured markets that chaos had limits. On the surface, this appeared benign, even rational, but standardization carries a hidden cost. It reduces local discretion. It prioritizes system stability over individual flexibility. What had once been diverse financial ecosystems began to converge towards centralized norms. These norms were not imposed violently, they were adopted pragmatically. During stress, uniformity feels like protection, but protection requires enforcement, and enforcement requires authority. Slowly, financial coordination transformed into institutional control. The ability to set standards became the ability to shape outcomes. What looked like neutral stabilization quietly expanded the reach of centralized decision-making beyond what calm conditions would have allowed. After 1873, crises were no longer treated as unpredictable accidents. They were studied, categorized, and prepared for. This marked another shift. Governments and financial institutions began to treat instability as a recurring condition rather than an exception. Crisis management stopped being reactive and became institutionalized. New tools were created, new roles emerged, and authority adapted to operate continuously, not temporarily. This was not about seizing power, it was about retaining readiness. But readiness has momentum. Structures built for emergencies rarely dismantle themselves. Instead, they search for relevance. Over time, the distinction between emergency response and normal governance blurred. Systems designed to intervene only under stress became embedded within everyday financial oversight. Power expanded not through ambition, but through preparedness. Every crisis introduces measures described as temporary. That language is deliberate. Temporary solutions lower resistance. They signal restraint. They reassure the public that normal rules will return. But systems operate differently than promises. Once an intervention stabilizes markets, removing it feels risky. Stability becomes dependent on the very tools introduced under stress. What was once extraordinary becomes familiar. Familiarity breeds acceptance. Acceptance breeds permanence. Over time, the baseline shifts. The public adjusts expectations downward, while institutions adjust authority upward. This is how power accumulates without confrontation, not by force, but by function. The system does not argue that it should retain control. It demonstrates that removing control might destabilize everything again. By the end of the 19th century, financial crises had taught institutions an enduring lesson. Panic is a training ground. Each collapse refines the mechanisms of control. Each recovery tests how far authority can extend without backlash. Over time, responses become faster, broader, and more confident, not because crises worsen, but because systems learn what they are permitted to do. The public experiences relief and remembers pain. Institutions experience success and remember leverage. This asymmetry matters because while societies move on, structures remain. And with every crisis managed successfully through expanded control, the idea that authority should contract afterward becomes harder to defend. What began as coordination becomes expectation. What began as necessity becomes doctrine. By the time the global economy collapsed in the late 1920s, financial crises were no longer abstract events confined to markets. This time, failure reached households directly. Jobs disappeared, savings evaporated, confidence collapsed alongside prices. The crisis was no longer experienced by bankers alone, it was lived by families. That shift changed everything. When suffering becomes social, pressure on governments intensifies. Stability stops being a technical goal and becomes a moral obligation. Authority is no longer justified by efficiency alone, but by responsibility. This is where crisis-driven power expansion gained a new foundation. Intervention was no longer framed as market correction, it was framed as protection. And protection carries a different kind of legitimacy. It invites permanence. The response to the Great Depression did not rely on one decision or one reform. It relied on institution building. New agencies emerged to manage credit, employment, banking stability, and social risk. These structures were designed to prevent future collapse, not just repair current damage. But prevention requires oversight. Oversight requires authority. Slowly, crisis response transformed into continuous supervision. Markets were no longer trusted to self-correct. Households were no longer expected to absorb volatility alone. The system shifted from reactive to paternal. This was not authoritarian, it was reassuring. But reassurance creates dependency, and dependency changes the balance between citizen and state. Once protection becomes expected, withdrawal feels like abandonment. One of the most underappreciated effects of the Great Depression was alignment. Financial relief tied survival to institutional stability. Employment programs, credit guarantees, and financial backstops did more than stabilize markets, they synchronized interests. When livelihoods depend on system continuity, resistance weakens. People stop asking whether authority should expand and start asking whether it will continue. This is not coercion, it is design. Dependency reshapes incentives quietly. Citizens become stakeholders in stability rather than participants in governance. Once that shift occurs, authority does not need to justify itself aggressively. It only needs to remain functional, and functionality becomes the new measure of legitimacy. When economies eventually stabilized, something unexpected happened. The expanded structures remained. Emergency institutions did not dissolve, they adapted. Oversight continued, safeguards multiplied. The rationale was simple. Removing protection could invite collapse again. The memory of pain lingered longer than the memory of expansion. This asymmetry mattered. Fear justified retention. Over time, authority no longer felt temporary, it felt prudent. Crisis measures were reframed as lessons learned, and lessons, once learned, are rarely unlearned. What began as response hardened into framework. The system did not return to its previous size, it recalibrated around its new role. By the mid-20th century, financial crises had reshaped expectations permanently. Markets were no longer spaces of pure risk, they were environments managed for stability. Volatility was tolerated only within bounds. Authority expanded not to eliminate failure, but to control its spread. This marked the normalization phase. Crisis-driven power no longer felt exceptional, it felt responsible. People adjusted to the idea that intervention was part of the system's architecture, and architecture, once built, defines movement. What had once required fear now required only habit. Crisis management stopped being a response, it became governance. By 2008, financial crises had evolved again. This time, the failure was not framed as a market error or social breakdown, it was framed as a systemic threat. Banks were no longer just institutions, they were infrastructure. Their collapse risked freezing payments, pensions, trade, and employment simultaneously. The language mattered. Once something is labeled systemic, it becomes untouchable. Governments did not step in to save individual firms, they stepped in to save continuity itself. Bailouts were justified not as favors but as firewalls. And when protection is framed as preventing collapse rather than rewarding failure, authority expands without resistance. The response to 2008 relied on tools once considered unthinkable. Trillions were created digitally. Interest rates were pushed to zero, then below. Central banks moved from referees to players. Balance sheets exploded. Yet what is most important is not what was done, it's what wasn't undone. When the immediate panic passed, the powers remained. Temporary measures became standing capabilities. Markets adapted around them. Asset prices learned to depend on intervention. Risk no longer disappeared, it migrated upward into institutions that promised to absorb it. The system survived, but it survived differently. Stability was no longer organic, it was engineered. After 2008, a subtle psychological shift occurred. Markets stopped reacting to fundamentals alone and began reacting to signals. What would central banks do? What would governments allow? Authority no longer waited for crisis to act, it acted to prevent discomfort. This created a new contract. Volatility was tolerated only if it didn't threaten confidence. Pain was delayed, smoothed, redistributed. But delaying consequences does not eliminate them, it concentrates them. Over time, expectations replaced discipline. The system became resilient on the surface and fragile underneath, not because of incompetence, but because control always trades transparency for calm. The pattern across 1873, 1929, and 2008 is consistent. Power does not expand through force, it expands through rescue. Each crisis lowers resistance to intervention. Each intervention resets the baseline of authority. What was once extraordinary becomes reasonable. What was once temporary becomes necessary. This is not a conspiracy. It is a feedback loop. Crises reward coordination. Coordination requires command. Command, once normalized, reshapes systems. The danger is not tyranny, it is dependency. When survival becomes linked to intervention, autonomy weakens without protest. People don't lose freedom suddenly, they outsource it gradually. Modern financial stability is not free, it is purchased with expanded authority, delayed consequences, and reduced tolerance for disorder. Crises are no longer moments to reset systems, they are used to reinforce them. Each rescue strengthens the belief that collapse will always be prevented. That belief itself becomes systemic risk. Because the more control expands to prevent pain, the more painful its failure would be. This is the paradox of modern finance. We did not eliminate crises, we redesigned them. And the next one will not ask whether power should expand, it will assume it must. This is History of Finance Decoded. Here, we don't chase headlines, we decode systems, how money, power, and crisis actually interact beneath the surface. If this episode changed how you see financial stability, support the channel. Like the video, subscribe, share it with someone who still believes crises are accidents. Because history does not repeat blindly, it repeats through structures. And once you see the pattern, you can never unsee it.